Rome, in the brutal winter of the year 40, under the iron fist of Gaius Caesar, famously known as Caligula, was a city suffocating under a climate of unimaginable terror. The emperor, with a chilling precision, wielded his absolute power not merely to govern, but to systematically dismantle the dignity of Rome itself. Ancient whispers passed down through generations speak of Senator Marcus Claudius, a man of venerable age and esteemed lineage. He was compelled by imperial decree to witness the profound and public violation of his own family's honor within the gilded walls of the emperor's palace. This was no isolated act of cruelty. It was a calculated threat in a meticulously woven tapestry of control, designed to shatter the most powerful Roman families from within, leaving them broken and complicit. Administrative scrolls meticulously recorded names and numbers. Those who passed through the bronze gates of the palace reduced to mere entries on parchment. Violence morphed into procedure. Degradation became state policy. Caligula's goal extended beyond inflicting suffering. He sought to force the victims' unwitting complicity, to make them partners in their own undoing. Fear became a political tool, shame a permanent scar etched across the heart of the Roman Senate. To grasp how Rome plunged into this abyss, we must rewind to a bright morning in the year 37. A young man, just 25, was then hailed as the empire's savior. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, affectionately nicknamed Caligula, Little Boot, because of the miniature military boots he wore as a child, was the beloved son of the revered general Germanicus. His ascension to power was met with an almost 100-day wave of public euphoria. The populace saw in him the rightful heir to a glorious dynasty. Senators, after the suffocating paranoia of Tiberius's reign, breathed a collective sigh of relief. No one, not a single soul, suspected this charming, educated young ruler would become the architect of the most methodically corrupt system Rome had ever known. Caligula's childhood was a strange tapestry of privilege and terror. He grew up amidst military camps, adored by the legions who revered his father. Yet, he also bore witness to the insidious palace intrigues that culminated in Germanicus's death, most likely by poison. He saw his mother, Agrippina the Elder, exiled. His brothers were imprisoned or executed, their fates sealed by the ruthless machinations of power. At Tiberius's court, young Caligula learned a brutal lesson in survival. He feigned harmlessness, played the fool, observing, learning. These years spent wearing a mask taught him that in Rome, survival depended on master deception, a skill he now possessed with chilling proficiency.
His early reign seemed to promise a golden age. Taxes were cut, political prisoners freed. Grand spectacles filled the city with celebration. Roads were repaired, aqueducts restored, and generous bonuses showered upon the legions. Rome worshipped him. Women strewed flowers in his path. Children sang songs in his name. Senators vied desperately for his favor. After the dark, oppressive years of Tiberius, this felt like an era of boundless hope. The contrast was stark, almost unbelievable. Where Tiberius had hidden away on Capri, Caligula walked openly through the streets, attended games, dined with senators. He was accessible, generous, magnetic. People truly believed the gods had at last blessed Rome with the perfect ruler. Then, in the autumn of the year 37, everything changed. A mysterious illness struck the emperor, confining him to his bed for weeks. Court physicians reported a raging fever, violent convulsions that required several men to restrain him, and delirious visions where he claimed to converse with Jupiter himself. Rome held its breath. Sacrifices piled high in every temple. Some citizens publicly vowed their own lives in exchange for the emperor's recovery. When Caligula finally awoke, he was no longer the man they had celebrated. At first, the signs were subtle, almost dismissible. He ordered statues of the gods to be altered, their divine faces replaced with his own image. Soon acts followed that stunned even the most hardened senators.
Those closest to him observed his terrifying transformation. His once warm eyes became cold, calculating, his gaze unnervingly fixed. He stopped sleeping, wandering the palace at night, speaking to statues, to the moon, to enemies only he could see, a chilling spectre in his own domain. Servants found him dawn in the palace gardens, covered in earth, claiming he had just planted the future of Rome. What he planted, however, were the sinister foundations of something far darker. The rot began within his own family. His sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, were not merely relatives, they became the first victims of his disintegrating mind. His fixation on Drusilla was particularly intense. He called her his Diana, elevated her to the status of an empress, treating her as a co-ruler in public ceremonies. When she died in the year 38, Caligula collapsed into a wild, uncontrollable grief. He forbade laughter, feasts, even bathing during the mourning period. Those who dared to show joy paid with their lives. Yet this grief was not love in any recognizable form. It was the rage of denied possession. After Drusilla's death, his chilling attention shifted to his remaining sisters, and beyond them, to the households of the Senate.
What followed was not chaos, but a meticulously engineered plan. Encounters were staged, observed, and recorded. Reactions were noted with chilling precision: obedience, hesitation, resistance. These records would later become instruments of absolute control. A senator who cooperated with excessive eagerness might find himself consistently voting in perfect alignment with imperial desires. One who hesitated could lose a son, or see his family utterly ravaged as a stark warning to others. The message was unmistakable. In Caligula's Rome, no one was innocent, no one neutral. This was just the beginning. The transformation of terror into state policy required structure, and Caligula ensured it had one. The imperial physician, Lucius Scribonius, left behind records hidden for centuries in a forgotten villa near Pompeii. In them, he dispassionately described how he was commanded to examine the wives and daughters of patricians, assessing their fertility and physical resilience for purposes beyond imagination. These examinations were conducted in the emperor's presence. Caligula posed intimate, invasive questions about their bodies, making notes as if overseeing livestock, not human beings. This was no random cruelty. It was bureaucratic. Each woman was assigned a number. Every act was documented. Fees were standardized. 16 curses for a senator's wife, 2,000 for his virgin daughter, 5,000 for both combined. The money flowed directly into the imperial treasury, registered as voluntary contributions for the welfare of the state. Violence was, once again, transmuted into cold, hard accounting. The palace itself was reconfigured to serve this perverse system. Caligula named it the Temple of Divine Service, and he meant it literally. Entire wings were repurposed for his grotesque theater. The Hall of Jupiter was reserved for ritualistic humiliations, where the emperor staged himself as the supreme god, demonstrating his absolute dominance. The Chamber of Venus forced Roman matrons into degrading displays that perverted mythological scenes. The Room of Priapus, adorned with obscene frescoes by Rome's finest artists, became a site of extreme debasement. The travertine marble walls, once echoing debates about the fate of the known world, now absorbed other, more horrifying sounds. And the senators, the very men who had built the empire, walked these corridors daily, heard everything, knew everything, yet said nothing. The system grew in terrifying complexity. First came the senators' wives, assigned schedules, specific transparent Syrian silk togas, worth fortunes, and rigid rituals. Then came the daughters. From the age of 12, they were progressively introduced to what Caligula termed divine education.
Hundreds of people kept the machinery running. Each fulfilled a single, compartmentalized function. Each diluted their guilt in the collective. No one saw themselves as a monster. They were merely cogs in a colossal, horrific machine. Full moon nights were reserved for special events, the so-called lunar fertility ceremonies. The palace's private amphitheater transformed into a pagan temple of terror. Senators' wives, women of high standing, were compelled to engage with gladiators chosen for their formidable strength. Sometimes these partners were Nubian slaves brought from the empire's furthest reaches, or even animals, trained bears, Molossian hounds, a leopard gifted by an African client king. Husbands sat in the stands, draped in their senatorial togas, maintaining a terrifying composure as their wives were degraded beyond all imagination, forced to endure spectacles designed solely for their humiliation. Caligula orchestrated the spectacle like a twisted, divine conductor, dictating the pairings, positions, and repetitions. He brandished a ceremonial scepter, adorned with golden phalli, pointing, commanding. Scribes, hidden in the shadows, meticulously recorded everything. It was the theater of absolute power, where human suffering was transformed into imperial entertainment. And around this horrifying stage, an entire economy of complicity flourished. Vendors offered salves for pain, healers whispered of abortive potions, their services in grim demand. Brokers coached young women on survival techniques within the palace walls. Physicians specialized in repairing the injuries of the divine service. Everyone demanded a fee, everyone profited. Rome itself became profoundly, irrevocably complicit in its own undoing. Bodies within the palace walls told stories no official chronicle would ever dare record. Scars formed patterns, a secret language of pain. Bellies swelled with unwanted pregnancies, hidden beneath loose garments, a constant, harrowing reminder. Faces forgot how to smile, their expressions permanently etched with terror and despair. There was a young woman named Valeria, daughter of a senator of minor rank. After months of systematic torment, she simply stopped speaking altogether. The physicians confirmed her vocal cords were intact. Words, it seemed, had simply abandoned her, leaving her in a profound internal silence. Her silence was so profound it disturbed even those hardened by the palace's horrors. They avoided her gaze, as if her vacant eyes reflected their own unavoidable, terrifying future. And Caligula's obsessions continued to evolve, each more elaborate, more depraved than the last. One particular obsession defined the final, darkest phase of his reign. He became fixated on forcing mothers to witness the degradation of their daughters, then reversing the roles, all while he recited the scenes as if they were poetry, a performance of his twisted philosophy.
For him, this was not mere impulse, it was a deeply reasoned philosophy. He believed that if he could utterly shatter the maternal bond, he could extinguish the very foundation of Rome itself. Pietas, the sacred duty to family, to the gods, and to the state, had built the empire. If he corrupted that, nothing would remain. It was a strategic assault on the Roman soul. In his deranged mind, these acts proved his divinity. The gods of myth did the same, he rationalized. Zeus took mortal women by force, disguised himself as beasts. Caligula saw himself not as a monster, but as the logical, indeed the divine continuation of ancient traditions. He was not breaking taboos, he was fulfilling them, transforming them into imperial policy. Attempts at resistance were whispered, desperate, and almost always deadly. Some women tried to poison themselves before being brought to the palace, stealing hemlock or wolfsbane from the imperial gardens, seeking an escape in death. Others disfigured their faces with knives or glowing coals, hoping to render themselves unappealing, beyond the emperor's twisted desires. Caligula, however, had answers for all of this. Those who attempted suicide were revived by imperial physicians, experts in poisons and antidotes, only to be punished with double sessions, sometimes publicly in the forum, a spectacle of defiance brutally crushed. Those who disfigured themselves were still used. Caligula declared beauty irrelevant to divine service. In fact, he claimed ugliness purified the act, stripping it of any aesthetic pleasure, making the degradation even more profound, more absolute. There was no escape.
Those who tried to flee were hunted down by the speculatores, the imperial secret police, a terrifying force of informers and enforcers. They were brought back for exemplary punishments that often involved their entire families. The terror was collective and deliberately so. The imperial archive grew incessantly, thousands of entries, ever more detailed, ever more chillingly dispassionate. Every act had a code, a category, a subcategory. Forms were filled, protocols followed, chains of command respected. It was the accounting of horror, as precise and methodical as tax records or census rolls. Sometimes, Caligula would read entries aloud in the Senate, randomly selected from the vast archive. Fathers and husbands were forced to listen as the intimate details of their family's degradation echoed through the hall. Entry 346, Julia, wife of Marcus Antonius I, 4 hours, 6 participants, pregnancy confirmed. Public shame was an integral part of the punishment. Trauma was meant to be remembered. Caligula wanted Rome to never forget what absolute power, untamed, could truly do. The Praetorian Guard, the elite imperial bodyguard, was indispensable to the system. They not only guarded it, they actively participated in its horrors.
After Caligula had finished with his victims, they were often passed on to the guards as a reward, another layer of calculated humiliation, further binding the powerful to his dark regime. Everything was documented, everything archived. Among the Praetorians was Cassius Chaerea, a veteran of the Germanic Wars, a man of hardened steel. Caligula relentlessly mocked him, ridiculing his voice, his very masculinity. He forced Chaerea to use obscene passwords, paraded him naked, stripped him of every shred of dignity. Chaerea participated in the system like the others, but something within him began to crack, not compassion, but a simmering, corrosive rage, a rage born of his own profound humiliation. The night of January 24, in the year 41, was particularly brutal. Caligula orchestrated a so-called bovine fertility contest. Senators' wives were compelled to compete with gladiators, numbers called out like bids at a grotesque auction, 20, 30, 40. Bodies moved mechanically, emptied of self, devoid of will. It was the final, most depraved ceremony. The next day, as Caligula walked through an underground corridor to the theater, Chaerea and several Praetorians ambushed him. They stabbed him 30 times, a gruesome, frenzied attack. A wound was intentionally inflicted upon his genitals, a final symbolic act of defiance against his perverse reign. His wife, Milonia Cassonia, was killed an hour later. Their 2-year-old daughter, Julia Drusilla, was brutally smashed against a wall. The Praetorians sought to obliterate the dynasty, but they could not erase the archives, the unwanted pregnancies, or the indelible scars etched on Rome's collective soul. The new emperor, Claudius, immediately proclaimed a damnatio memoriae. Statues were destroyed, coins melted down, Caligula's name erased from inscriptions. But some things, once done, can never truly be undone. The children born from the emperor's twisted breeding program grew up without knowing their true parentage, living as spectral reminders of a brutal past. The adult victims aged with unspeakable secrets, forever locked behind their lips. Fathers who had once held torches could never again look their daughters in the eye without a haunting sense of their own complicity. It was not merely a man who died that day. It was a system, a monstrous bureaucracy of terror, and systems, even when their creators are gone, have a sinister way of surviving. Thunder rumbled in the night skies over Rome as Caligula met his violent end. Marcus Claudius, the senator who had once been forced to bear witness, applauded the emperor's death with the very same hands that had once held a torch in that horrific palace. His daughter Claudia, number 247 in the grim imperial ledger, never spoke again. Her silence was a living, breathing testament to Caligula's reign. Caligula did not invent depravity. What he invented was the chillingly efficient manual for institutionalizing it, for turning individual cruelty into state policy. And manuals, even when purportedly burned, have a way of being rewritten.
their lessons remembered in the darkest corners of the human mind. Children of the empire learned a final, devastating lesson. Some evils outlive their perpetrators. They nestle into institutions, becoming embedded, passed down from generation to generation like an inherited disease, a corrosive legacy. If this story has disturbed you, share it, not for shock value, but for memory. Forgetting how systems of abuse are built is precisely how they are rebuilt, piece by horrifying piece. Subscribe for more stories where the past wants the present, where monsters are not myths but men with too much power. It was a time when the boundaries between man and God blurred, not through divine revelation, but through the perverse imagination of a single man. Caligula saw himself not as Jupiter's representative, but as his living incarnation. This belief was more than a personal conviction, it was the chilling foundation for his entire political ideology. The whole of Roman society became a stage for his divine performance, and every citizen, from senator to slave, was an unwilling, terrified actor in his grotesque play. The dehumanization of his victims began with language itself. Words like divine service or heavenly blessing were chillingly employed to describe the most brutal, debased acts. This was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, meticulously designed to twist reality, to subvert any moral resistance, to make the unspeakable seem sanctified. If the deeds were done in the name of the gods, who dared to question them? Who could even articulate their horror when the very words used to describe them were warped beyond recognition? The impact of this twisted logic was profound, shattering. People began to view themselves and their fellow citizens through Caligula's eyes as mere objects to be manipulated and used according to his capricious will. The concept of pietas, the deeply rooted Roman duty to family, gods and state, was not merely destroyed, it was utterly perverted and redefined, made to serve Caligula's monstrous purposes, turning sacred bonds into instruments of his power. The story of Valeria, who lost her voice, is a microcosm of what happened to Rome itself. Her silence was not just an expression of personal trauma, it was a powerful symbol for the voicelessness of an entire society, collapsing under the immense pressure of fear, unable to cry out. Her eyes, reflecting the unavoidable future, were the eyes of all those who saw what was coming, who understood the impending doom, but found themselves utterly unable to speak, to warn, to resist.
The very architecture of the palace became a tool of oppression. The venerable halls, where once the destinies of the empire had been debated and decided, were transformed into stages for humiliation and cruelty, silent witnesses to unspeakable acts. This physical transformation chillingly mirrored Rome's internal shift, from a republic founded on laws and traditions to an empire governed by the unhinged whim of a tyrant, where justice was replaced by caprice. The accounts of forced births and of children raised as imperial property are particularly harrowing. They reveal how Caligula's system not only terrorized the present lives of Romans, but also ruthlessly stole their future. These children, uprooted and robbed of their identity, were the living trophies of his power, a generation destined from birth to live in the perpetual shadow of his malevolent reign, their innocence forever stained. Yet, even in this profound darkness, there were tiny, desperate sparks of resistance, like the women who attempted to poison or disfigure themselves. These desperate acts of self-harm were not a surrender, but the last defiant screams of a dignity that refused to be completely extinguished. They showed that even in the most extreme oppression,
The human spirit sought some form of control over its own fate, even if that control extended only to the choice of one's own death, a final, tragic assertion of self. Caligula's responses to these attempts at resistance were just further proof of his perverse genius. He turned every escape attempt into yet another form of punishment, every disfigurement into a new justification for his atrocities, twisting their acts into further means of his own control. He taught Rome that there was truly no escape, that his power was absolute, and that even the desperate attempt to evade it would only lead to even greater suffering, binding his victims ever more tightly to his will. The damnatio memoriae after his death was a frantic, desperate attempt to erase Caligula's memory from history. Yet, as became clear, some scars cannot simply wipe away or forgotten. The physical remnants of his system, the archives, the unwanted pregnancies, the silent scars on bodies and souls, persisted, telling a story that no imperial decree could ever erase. They were the silent witnesses of a time that must never be forgotten, a testament to enduring horror. The children of the empire, who learned from the horrors of Caligula, became the reluctant bearers of this bitter truth. Some evils outlive their perpetrators. They nestle into institutions, are passed down from generation to generation like an insidious hereditary disease. This lesson was a profound warning for the future, a grim reminder that vigilance against unchecked power must never, ever wane. For systems of abuse, even when their creators are dead, always find ways to reinvent themselves if the memory of their origins fades.
Caligula's story is thus more than just the biography of a mad emperor. It is a chilling parable about the dangers of absolute power and the profound necessity of constantly remembering how easily freedom and dignity can crumble in a climate of fear and terror. It is a stark reminder that evil does not always appear in the guise of a monster, but often in that of a man with too much power, one who declares his own perversion to be divine order. The earth swallowed Caligula's blood, but not his seed of terror. As news of his violent death raced through Rome, a brief wild euphoria erupted. Yet the relief was fragile, a thin veil over a deep-seated trauma that continued to fester beneath the surface. The Praetorians had killed the tyrant, but the system he had created lived on in the shadows, an unseen menace. It was etched into the hearts of the people, into the very walls of the palace, and into the silent, enduring screams of the survivors. The new emperor, Claudius, made desperate efforts to erase Caligula's memory. Statues were toppled, his coins melted down, his name chiseled out of inscriptions. It was a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory, a decree to forget. But how does one erase what is burned into the soul? How does one incinerate the invisible archives that existed in the minds of the victims? The lists of names, the sequence of atrocities, the fees demanded, all of it was more deeply imprinted than on any parchment, a living, breathing record of suffering. Marcus Claudius, who had once been compelled to hold the torch as his daughter Claudia, grimly recorded as number 247, was designated for divine service, could barely sleep in the first nights after Caligula's death. He applauded the tyrant's end, yet his hands, once raised in a cheer, now felt eternally defiled, stained by his forced participation. Claudia never spoke again. Her silence was a living monument to Caligula's reign, an echo of Valeria, who had fallen silent even earlier. Many women throughout the empire shared her fate. They carried their scars and secrets like invisible chains, a legacy of terror that would outlast any public memory or official decree. The children who had emerged from the breeding program were a generation of shadow children. Never knowing who their true parents were, they were raised as imperial property, their destinies warped by a power they could not comprehend. Their fate was a dark chapter that would never appear in any official chronicle, erased from public discourse. They were the silent witnesses of a cruel experiment,
the living proof that Caligula's system not only destroyed individuals but also robbed them of their identity and their future, leaving them adrift in a sea of stolen lives.
The bureaucracy of horror did not vanish overnight. The specialized scribes, the doctors and midwives, the guards and accountants, they had all learned to be cogs in this horrifying machinery. Their individual guilt was diluted in the collective, their consciences numbed by routine. And even if Claudius ordered the archives burned, the knowledge of how such a system functioned remained. It was a blueprint of perversion, a detailed manual on how to abuse power, break dignity, and coerce entire societies into complicity, a terrifying testament to human depravity. This manual, though not carved in stone, outlived Caligula. It lingered in the minds of the survivors, in the whispered stories passed on in hushed tones, and in the deep fear that resonated within Roman institutions long after his death. The mechanisms of dehumanization, of forced complicity, of bureaucratized cruelty, these were not tied to Caligula's person alone. They were universal tools of tyranny, capable of being resurrected by anyone who possessed the necessary ruthlessness and unchecked power. Rome had witnessed how quickly humanity could crumble when the foundations of ethics and law were undermined, when moral compasses were shattered. Caligula's story is not a simple tale of a mad emperor. It is a cautionary narrative about how systems of abuse are born, how they embed themselves into the very fabric of a society, and how incredibly difficult it is to eradicate them once they take root. It is a profound reminder that we must constantly remember the dangers of absolute power, the insidious allure of complicity, and the duty of every individual to resist, even when the price of that resistance is tragically high. For the evil that flourished in Caligula's palace was not merely the madness of one man, but a deeper infection, a societal disease that can afflict any society that loses its vigilance. It is a chilling reminder that monsters do not always spring from myths, but often from men with too much power, who declare their own perversion to be divine order. Hence the message for our own time. Caligula's story is not a mere anecdote from antiquity. It is a mirror, reflecting back to us the timeless nature of the mechanisms of oppression. Pay attention to the small beginnings, the subtle erosions of freedom, the seemingly harmless demands for blind obedience. For forgetting how systems of abuse are constructed is the first perilous step to their reconstruction. Be vigilant, learn from the past, and ensure that such stories are never silenced.